She shared a roof with him for 2 years. Same kitchen, same table, same quiet mornings. And yet the most honest thing she ever said to him, he heard through a wall in the dark, while she was asleep and didn't know she was saying it at all. She said his name. Not the polite version, not the careful version she used at breakfast. The real one. The one that had been sitting in her chest for 2 years, waiting for a moment when she wasn't guarding herself anymore. And he heard it, and he got up from that kitchen table, and he walked down that hallway, and he did something that 2 years of a cold, separate, perfectly functional marriage had never once taught either of them to do. He went to her, not to fix anything, not to say anything, just to be in the room. Because sometimes that is the whole of what love looks like, and we miss it because we are too busy waiting for something louder. This channel is where the West comes alive in the stories that matter most. Cowboys and open land, and the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. Stories about what it means to stay, to show up, to see another person clearly in a world that moves too fast for that kind of looking. Every story here is about the things that hold us together when everything else gets hard. What this story gave me, and what I hope it gives you, is a simple but difficult truth. Closeness is a risk, but distance is not safety. Distance is just a longer way of losing someone. The bravest thing two people can do is stop protecting themselves from each other and start being honest about what they actually need. Not in grand speeches, in small, real, repeated actions. Like a chair moved 2 feet from the wall. Like a name in a county record. Like getting up in the dark and going to the person who called for you. If this story found something in you that needed finding, stay with us. There are more stories here that will do the same thing. Hit, like if this one stayed with you. Leave a comment and tell us what you took from it. We read every single one. Share it with someone who needs to hear that love does not have to be loud to be real. And subscribe, because we will be here, telling these stories, for as long as stories like this one still matter.
The bandage had to go on straight or it was useless. Ellie knew that. She had known it for 20 years, had wrapped more legs than she could count, had done this particular leg 46 times in the past 3 months. Her hands knew the steps without her brain having to supervise. Pull the gauze taut, but not tight. Overlap by half. Keep the tension even. So she could not explain why her hands were not cooperating this morning. Not shaking. Nothing that dramatic. Just a small, stubborn unsteadiness that kept pulling her work slightly off from where she wanted it. She had already unwrapped and started over twice. Roan, for his part, was being a gentleman about it. The big Appaloosa stood with the patience of an animal that had learned, over 3 months of daily bandage changes, that the woman kneeling beside his left leg was trying to help him, and that the fastest way to get it over with was to stand still. Ellie appreciated that about him. She pressed the end of the bandage flat and held it with 2 fingers while she tore a strip of medical tape with her teeth. The barn smelled the way Montana barns smell in October. Hay and old wood and something clean underneath, the particular cold that came before the real cold, the kind that sat in the air without biting yet. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten, not sunrise. The half hour before sunrise, when the darkness went from black to a deep charcoal gray, and you could start to see shapes without being able to name colors. She had been out here since 5:15. She preferred it that way. The barn was hers in the early morning. Nobody asked her questions out here. Nobody expected anything from her except competence. And competence she had plenty of. She secured the last strip of tape and sat back on her heels. The leg looked good, better than it had 3 months ago, when she had first found Roan standing in the far corner of this stall. Weight shifted entirely off the left front, the joint swollen and warm to the touch, and oozing, just enough to tell her this was not something that would heal on its own. She had gone back to the house that first morning and said, "The horse needs a vet." And Callum had looked up from the table and said, "You are a vet." And she had said, "I am a technician, and I need actual supplies." And that had been, more or less, the most substantive conversation they had managed in several weeks. She stood up and rolled her shoulders, checked the stall latch, checked the water bucket. The kitchen light in the main house was on. She could see it through the barn's small, east-facing window, a warm yellow rectangle in the gray morning. Callum was up then, or had been up. She was never entirely sure of the sequence, whether he had slept at all, or whether he had simply stayed at the kitchen table long enough that getting up seemed beside the point. In 2 years of marriage, she did not know what time her husband went to sleep. She turned away from the window and went to wash her hands at the barn utility sink. The water came out cold enough to make her breath catch. She let it run while she thought about nothing in particular, which was her preferred way of thinking about everything. She had found something last night, or this morning, rather, depending on how you counted. She had come out to the barn at 5:15 and opened the medical log she kept on the shelf above the supply cabinet, intending to record yesterday's observation notes before she started the new bandage. And she had found on the last written page an entry that was not hers. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Someone who was not accustomed to writing in a medical log, but had tried to do it correctly. Time, temperature, wound appearance, what had been applied. The entry was from 11 p.m. the previous night, when she had been in bed for 2 hours. Callum had come to the barn at 11 p.m. and changed Rowan's bandages and written it down in her log, and had not said a single word to her about it. She dried her hands on the rough cloth hanging by the sink and stood there for a moment. The barn was quiet, except for Rowan moving in his stall, the slow, methodical sound of an animal shifting weight and settling. 2 people, same barn, same horse, same work, neither of them knowing the other was doing it. She picked up her bag and walked back to the house. The kitchen was warm. Callum was at the counter, already in his work coat, pouring coffee. He heard her come in and half-turned. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She went to the table and sat down. Her mug was already there, already filled. She did not know if she had done that, or if he had. She genuinely could not remember. He brought his own coffee and sat across from her. He had the day's work list on a folded piece of paper, the kind he made every evening for the next morning. She watched him unfold it and smooth it flat on the table with the side of his hand. A deliberate gesture. The gesture of a man who liked things in their proper order. She thought about the log entry, the careful handwriting. 11 o'clock at night, alone in the barn, doing the work she thought only she was doing. She thought about saying something. She did not say anything. He pushed the work list slightly to the side and picked up his coffee. Outside, the sky was going from charcoal to a pale, bleached blue, the first color of the day. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked out the window and decided, without quite deciding it, that some things could wait. Later, she would understand that both of them had been deciding that for 2 years. The separate rooms had been Callum's idea. Or rather, he had suggested it, and she had agreed, and neither of them had looked too directly at why. He had said it was because he kept early hours, that he didn't want to disturb her, that the guest room had its own good mattress, and she would sleep better with the whole bed to herself. All of these things were true. None of them were the whole story. She had agreed because agreement was her default, because she had spent 16 years in Denver learning to read the shape of what a man wanted, and then fitting herself into it, and Callum's shape said, distance is safer. She understood that shape. She had her own version of it. The house had been Sarah's house first. Sarah had died here. Sarah's coffee mugs were still in the cabinet, 4 of them with a blue rim pattern, and Ellie used one of them every morning and had never once thought to mention it, because what would she say? She felt the absence of another woman in this house the way you feel a room that has been recently rearranged. You couldn't say exactly what had moved, but your body knew the furniture had been in different places. Madison called on Sundays. Ellie had learned to find something to do in another part of the house during those calls. It was not a rule anyone had made. It was a pattern that had established itself quietly, the way most of the patterns in this house had established themselves. She cooked dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He cooked on Mondays and Wednesdays. Fridays were whoever got inside first. This had evolved from nothing. From the first weeks when they were both overly polite, and then gradually, almost invisibly, it had become routine. She did the laundry on Saturdays. He handled the outdoor water systems. She managed the veterinary supplies. He managed the equipment and the fencing. A marriage organized like a business arrangement. Functional. Efficient. Quiet in the wrong way. She set her mug down and looked at Callum across the table. He was reading his work list. His jaw was set in the particular way it got in the morning, before the day had softened him at all. He had a long face, weathered from years of outdoor work, lines around his eyes that had come from squinting into Montana sun and wind. Good hands. She noticed his hands a lot, because they were always doing something. Right now, they were holding the list with the same deliberate steadiness he brought to everything he touched. He felt her looking and glanced up. Leg looks better, she said, because that was the neutral thing to say. The work thing. Safe ground. He nodded. How much longer? 2 more weeks of daily wrapping. Then we can drop to every other day and start letting him put real weight on it. Good. He nodded again and went back to his list. She picked up her coffee. The kitchen clock read 6:42. In roughly 12 hours, she would go back to her room, and he would go back to his room, and the house would settle into its nighttime quiet with that thin wall between them that neither of them had ever once crossed. She did not know yet that this was the last ordinary morning. She would know soon. 3 days after she found the log entry, Callum came to the barn while she was working. Not unusual. He came out most mornings to check on things. What was unusual was that he came at 7:30, which was when she was typically in the middle of Roan's morning treatment, and instead of stopping at the door the way he usually did, he came all the way in and stood on the other side of the horse. Ellie had already started. She had the old bandage cut and the wound exposed, and she was in the process of flushing it with saline solution. She looked up when she heard him come in. He looked at the wound without saying anything. Then he moved to Roan's head and took hold of the halter and held it. He had positioned himself correctly. not guessing. Correctly. The exact hold that kept a horse still, without making it feel trapped, one hand at the noseband, one along the jaw, the position of someone who had done this before. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her steadily. She went back to work. They did not talk about the arrangement. He held. She worked. Roan stood quiet between them. The barn had its morning sounds, the creak of old wood, a bird somewhere in the rafters, the soft knock of the water bucket swinging on its hook. "He's putting more weight on it," Callum said eventually. His voice was low, and even the way he kept it when he didn't want to startle the animal. "Yes, started 2 days ago. That's a good sign." "How did it happen?" She paused. "How did what happen?" "The original injury." She kept her eyes on her work. Fence line. East pasture. In the storm last July, he got spooked and went through a section that had a broken wire nobody had caught yet. A pause. "I hadn't caught it," Callum said. "I was going to do the East Line check that week." She heard something in his voice that she did not have a name for. Not guilt, exactly. Something quieter. The way a person sounds when they have been carrying something for a while, and the weight of it is so familiar, they don't even notice it lifting anymore when they finally say it out loud. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "Storms find the weak spots." "That's what they do." He did not answer, but she felt the slight change in the pressure of his hold on Roan's halter. A small easing. She finished the wound flush and began laying in the new gauze. "Can you keep him steady for another 3 minutes?" "Yes, thank you." 2 words. She said them without thinking, and then was immediately aware of having said them, in the particular self-conscious way that happens when you realize you don't usually say a certain thing to a certain person, and saying it has made the air slightly different. He did not respond, but he kept Roan steady for exactly as long as she needed. The rain came at noon, not the gentle kind, the serious, October in Montana kind, which came down in a gray curtain and turned the fields the color of a very old photograph. Ellie was in the barn reorganizing the supply cabinet when the first heavy drops hit the roof. Within 2 minutes, leaving was out of the question without getting thoroughly soaked. She pulled the stool over and sat near the door and watched it come down. Callum came in from the far end of the barn, ducking through the interior door from the equipment side. His jacket was dark with water across the shoulders. He stopped when he saw her, then kept walking to the hook on the wall, where he kept a dry cloth for exactly this kind of situation. He wiped his face and hands and stood beside the open door, looking out at the rain the way farmers look at weather, measuring it, thinking about what it meant for the afternoon. She was aware of him the way she had become aware of him lately, not acutely. More the way you become aware of a sound that has been there for a while once you stop being able to ignore it. The smell came then. That particular smell of Montana dirt when rain first hits it. Not everywhere had this smell. Denver had not had this smell. This was something about the specific composition of the soil here. The alkalinity or the mineral content, she wasn't sure of the science of it. She just knew it hit her in the back of the throat every time and did something to her chest that she was not going to think too carefully about. Sarah used to say this smell made her feel like she was home. Callum said. He said it quietly, looking at the rain. Not at her. Ellie did not move. She had not heard him mention Sarah in 2 years. Not once in 2 years. She had wondered about that, whether it was grief or discretion, or simply his personality, which ran towards silence on most things. She sat with the sentence for a moment. Sat with the fact that he had said it to her her, or at least near her, which was maybe the closest he came. This is her home, Ellie said carefully. Was, yes. The rain came down steadily. Roan moved in his stall and then was still. Is it yours? Callum asked, still looking at the rain. She did not answer right away. It was the kind of question that deserved thinking about, that she had been thinking about, in some form or another, for 2 years, without quite framing it that directly. I don't know yet, she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He nodded slowly, as though this was an acceptable answer, as though he understood what it meant to not know yet. They stood there while the rain came down, not quite side by side, and said nothing else. But the silence after that exchange was different from the silence before it, slightly lighter, a degree less careful. Late that afternoon, Roan tried to bear weight on all 4 legs at once. It happened without announcement. Ellie was recording notes at the small shelf desk in the corner. Callum was checking the water system connections along the back wall. The horse shifted, adjusted, tried the sound 4 hooves on the stall floor, even, all 4. Ellie put her pen down. Callum went still. Roan stood there, testing it, cautious. His left leg still compensating slightly, still years of habit built around protecting that joint, but down, bearing weight. Real weight. Neither of them spoke. She heard Callum exhale. Not a dramatic sound, not a sigh of relief. Just breath that had been held a fraction too long, finally released. The sound of something heavy being quietly set down. She knew that sound. She knew it in herself. The specific release of tension you didn't realize you were holding until it was gone. She picked up her pen, wrote in the log. Day 64, left front, full weight bearing, attempted. Duration approximately 40 seconds. Positive prognosis. She heard Callum move back to the water connections. The small sounds of his work. The 2 of them in the same space, getting on with things, not making anything of what had just happened between them. But she thought about it later, in her room, before sleep. She thought about how he had gone to the barn at 11 o'clock at night to check on the horse and had written in her log so she would know. She thought about the way he had positioned himself this morning without being shown where to stand. She thought about the sound of his breath when Roan put weight on that leg. She thought about a man who kept careful distance from every person in his life and went alone in the dark to make sure a horse was okay. She didn't know what to do with that yet, but she was starting to think the story she had been telling herself about Callum Hayes might be missing some significant chapters. She started noticing things she should have noticed sooner. That was how it worked, she supposed. You looked at something every day, and your brain decided it was background, decided it was just the way things were, and stopped actually seeing it. And then something small changed, some angle shifted, and suddenly you were seeing what had been in front of you the whole time. The winter stores in the main storage barn. She had walked past them dozens of times. She knew they were there. She had never thought about how much there was. She thought about it now, standing inside the storage barn with a clipboard, while Callum called out numbers, and she recorded them. He ran inventory the way an engineer would. Everything categorized, everything cross-referenced. Hay bales in a precise count, grain, feed supplements, salt blocks, medical supplies in a separate tally, equipment fuel, spare parts, tools. It was more than one man and one horse needed. It had always been more than that. She could see it clearly now that she was writing the numbers down instead of simply walking past them. This was not accidental overstock. This was intentional. The supply levels had been calculated for multiple people, for a working ranch at full capacity, even though Irangate at the moment was a man by himself and a horse recovering from a leg injury. "Do you always keep it at this level?" she asked. Callum looked up from his clipboard. "What level?" She gestured at the hay bales. "This much." He looked at what she was pointing to. "Yes, it's more than you need." A pause. "I know." She waited to see if he would say anything else. He went back to his clipboard. She wrote down the last of the grain numbers and did not push. Some questions, she had learned, answered themselves if you gave them enough space. She gave this one space. Later that day, walking the north fence line to check for winter damage before the serious cold set in, she was moving ahead of him. She had not planned it that way. She had simply started walking, and he had fallen in behind her, and now she was in front, pointing out the sections that needed attention, and he was following. It had happened naturally, without comment, because she knew this fence. She had walked it twice already in the past 2 months. Once in early September, when she had noticed a section starting to lean, once a few weeks later when she had come back to fix it. She knew which posts were original and which ones were newer replacements. She knew which stretches tended to shift after rain. She knew this fence better than she had realized she knew it. She stopped at the post she had replaced herself in September. New wood, still lighter than the weathered posts around it, set at the correct angle, tamped down properly, because she did not do things halfway. Callum stopped beside her and looked at it. She watched his face. He studied the post the way he studied things. Carefully, thoroughly. "You replaced this," he said. "September. The old one was failing." He was quiet for a moment. He reached out and tested the new post with his hand, pressing at the base, checking the stability. It did not move. "The storage room door," he said. "Before that, you rehung it so it sits level." She had done that in August when the door had started catching on the frame. "And before that," he said, "you patched the southeast section of the barn roof. It was leaking on Roan's stall." He nodded slowly. He was still looking at the fence post, not at her. "I've noticed all of it," he said. "I just haven't." He stopped. He stopped. She waited. "Said anything," he finished. The words came out with a slight difficulty, like a man speaking in a language he was not quite fluent in. She looked at the fence post, because it was easier than looking at him right now. "I didn't do it expecting anything," she said. "It needed doing." "I know." And then, after a moment, "That doesn't mean I shouldn't have said something." She did not know what to do with that, with a man who was plainly uncomfortable with acknowledgement, and was doing it anyway, clumsily because he felt it was owed. She filed it away without examining it too closely, the way you file away something that might be important later. They continued along the fence line. She pointed out the weak sections. He noted them. The Montana sky above them was the specific gray-blue of a cold October afternoon, enormous and uncomplicated the way the sky was out here, nothing between you and the horizon for miles. He walked behind her the rest of the way. She noticed that, too. It was on a Wednesday that she started to understand what she was living in. She drove into Crestfall for her regular supplies, the veterinary clinic where she worked part-time, Pete Hendricks's general store for the household list, the farmer's market for hay. Pete was talkative, the way small-town storekeepers were talkative, not nosily. He just liked conversation. He had the cheerful, uncomplicated quality of a man who had built something modest and solid and was genuinely satisfied with it. While he was ringing up her order, he said, conversationally, that he had been doing a larger winter stock order than usual for Callum. More than any year since he came back, Pete said. He must have a lot going on out there this season. She smiled and said that things were busy and moved to the next item on her list. But she heard it. A lot going on out there. More stores than any year since he came back. Since he came back meant after Sarah, after 6 years of living here alone, or with Madison when she came home for breaks. 6 years of presumably buying supplies for one person and one horse and whatever ranch machinery needed maintaining. And this year, the year she came, the order was bigger. She thought about the inventory numbers she had written down in the storage barn. The hay, the grain, the supplies, all of it above what one man required. He had prepared for her before either of them had thought to say anything out loud. She was still thinking about it when she stopped in at Dot's for coffee. Old Earl was where Old Earl always was, in the corner chair by the window, with his insulated mug and his 78 years of local knowledge. He watched her sit down, let her get half her coffee in before he said anything. "You know why he set up separate rooms?" Earl said. She looked up. Earl was looking at the window, not at her. "Not because he doesn't want you close." Sarah was sick 9 months before he figured it out. Living together, same bed, same table, and he didn't see it until a doctor told him what he'd been looking at. She did not say anything. "Man like that decides he's a liability," Earl said. "Decides the kindest thing is to not be close enough to miss something again." He took a sip of his coffee, still not looking at her. "Doesn't mean he's right," he added. "Just means that's where he is." She drove home in the particular quiet of someone who has just had a thing they already half knew, articulated clearly for the first time. The road back to Irongate was 10 miles of straight highway, and then 7 miles of county road through the low hills. She knew every curve of it. She had driven it hundreds of times in 2 years. She drove it now and sat with what Earl had said and what Pete had said and what the numbers in the storage barn had said, all of it settling into a shape she had not seen before. Both of them had built this. Not him alone, not her alone. She had walked into this marriage with her distance already intact. She had arranged it so that she was useful but not necessary, present but not intrusive, so thoroughly shaped to fit into a space without disturbing it that she had essentially agreed to her own disappearance. And he had arranged it so that he could care for her from far enough away that if anything went wrong, he wouldn't be close enough to miss it. Two people protecting each other in ways that left both of them alone. She pulled into the Irongate driveway and sat in the truck for a moment before going in. The kitchen light was on. His truck was there. Inside, he was probably at the table with his work lists, being methodical and thorough and quietly competent, the way he was at everything. Taking care of the ranch the way he had always taken care of everything within his reach. She thought about the stores in the barn, the careful inventory, the supplies bought for more than one person a full year before she'd arrived. She went inside. November came in with the first serious cold. Not the pleasant cold of October, the kind that smelled good and made the air feel clean. The November cold that came down off the mountains with intention. It got into the house through the window seams, and the gap under the back door, and the spot in the kitchen ceiling where the insulation had never been quite right. She had caulked the windows in October. He had fixed the back door seal without her asking him to. The ceiling spot remained an ongoing negotiation with physics. They had begun having breakfast together differently. Not dramatically differently, just that she stopped going to the barn first and coming back to eat alone after he had already gone out. She started coming downstairs at the same time he did. They cooked together in the small kitchen in the way of two people who had learned each other's habits. She knew he needed the left burner for his eggs because the right burner ran hot. He knew she needed the counter space near the window to cut things because she was left-handed and the window gave her more room. These small negotiations had happened without discussion. They had simply happened, repeated, until they became the shape of the morning. She noticed things differently now. The way he always put the extra coffee on the counter, next to her mug when he poured his own, so the option was there without her having to ask. The way he came back in from the barn at midday and knocked the mud off his boots outside before he came in, so she didn't have to clean it up, even though she had never once complained about mud. The way he kept the firewood stacked on her side of the porch closer than on his side, so she had less distance to carry it. Small things, none of them discussed, all of them deliberate. She was reassembling him from these details, building a different picture than the one she had been using for 2 years. One afternoon, she was looking for her notebook in the kitchen drawer, where she kept her clinic paperwork. She pulled the drawer open and started shifting things, and the corner of a folder caught her eye because her name was printed on the tab. Her name, in Callum's handwriting. She stood there for a moment. Then she took the folder out and opened it. The document inside was legal paper. County of Crestfall letterhead, property records. Eleanor Marie Hayes was listed as a co-owner of the Irongate property. Not a small percentage, not a gesture. Full co-ownership, 50%, in the manner of equal partners. The kind of ownership that meant the property could not be sold, transferred, or substantially altered without her signature and her consent. The notary stamp was from 18 months ago, 6 months after their wedding. She stood at the kitchen counter and read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because her brain kept doing something strange with the information, kept sliding off it, like it couldn't quite get traction. 6 months after a marriage of convenience. 6 months after two practical people had signed their names at the courthouse because it made certain logistical sense. 6 months after no romantic vows and a lunch at Dot's Diner. He had gone to a lawyer and put her name on the land that had been in his family for 3 generations, and had not said a single word about it. She put the folder back in exactly the place she had found it, closed the drawer, stood at the counter, looking at the Montana afternoon through the kitchen window. The Westfield was doing that thing it did in November, going from brown to a pale, almost silvery color, as the cold stripped the last moisture out of the grass. Beautiful, in a sparse way. Desolate, if you were in the wrong mood. She was not in the wrong mood. She was in some mood she did not have a name for. She thought about what Earl had said, about a man who decided distance was the kindest option. About protection as the shape grief took in people who had learned that closeness cost something serious. She thought about what it meant to put someone's name on your family's land without being able to say why. She did not ask him about it that night, or the next night. She was still finding the right shape for the words. She got sick on a Tuesday. Nothing serious. The kind of cold that went around in October and November that her body had handled without incident for 44 years. A scratchy throat, a heaviness in the head, the specific fatigue that wasn't quite like regular tiredness. She ignored it through the morning and the afternoon, and by evening, she was ignoring it loudly, which is to say, with obvious effort, which Callum noticed. He didn't say anything. He just left a box of cold medicine on the kitchen table beside the salt shaker. She saw it when she came back from checking on Roan, stood there, looking at it for a moment, picked it up, took it to her room. She went to bed at 8:30, which was an admission in itself. She lay in the dark with her body doing its inefficient work against the virus. And outside the wind had picked up, and the house made its winter sounds, the low creak of settling and the hiss of air through the window gap she hadn't got to yet. She was asleep by 9. Callum sat at the kitchen table past midnight. He had been going over the winter financials, a task he did every November, quiet work that required focus and was therefore well suited to the late hours. Numbers made sense to him. The ranch made sense to him. He was comfortable in this kitchen at this hour with the house quiet around him and the work in front of him. He heard something through the wall, not a sound he could immediately categorize, not a crash or a cry, nothing that loud. A voice, low, indistinct, coming from the direction of the bedrooms. He went still and listened. It came again, his name, in her voice. Not the way she said it at breakfast or in passing in the hallway. The way a person says a name in a dream, the way a voice sounds when the sleeping mind has stripped away all the careful management of the waking one. There was a need in it that he had not heard from her before. Something unguarded. He sat there for a long moment. Then he got up from the table and walked to the hallway. Her door was closed. He stood in front of it, listening, the uneven rhythm of someone sick and sleeping badly, a small shift and murmur. He thought about knocking. He thought about going back to the kitchen. He thought about 18 months ago, sitting at a lawyer's desk, signing a document he had never shown her. He thought about the reason he had never shown her, which was that showing her would mean a conversation. He did not know how to start, and he had been telling himself he would find the words eventually, and eventually had somehow kept not arriving. He pushed the door open quietly. The room was dark, except for the faint blue of the yard light coming through the curtains. He could see her in the bed, the shape of her under the blanket, turned on her side. He knew where the extra blanket was. He had put it in her closet himself in August, before the cold set in, without telling her it was there. He went and got it, now, and laid it over her, carefully, so she would not wake. He went to the window and pulled the curtain tighter against the draft. The glass of water on the nightstand was empty. He took it and went to the bathroom and refilled it and brought it back. Then he stood in the dark room and looked at his wife sleeping with the extra blanket over her. He pulled the corner chair from the wall and set it just inside the door, angled slightly toward the room, and sat down. He did not know exactly why. She was fine. She was sick, not dangerously. She did not need anyone watching over her. She did not need him in particular. But she had called his name. In her sleep, unguarded, without intending to, she had called his name. He stayed. He sat in the chair in the dark and listened to her breathing, and after a while it went even. The scratchy rhythm of someone sick smoothed out into something deeper. He watched the room in the dark the way he had watched many rooms in the dark over the years, because the dark did not unsettle him, and because he was good at keeping still. She did not wake. At 4:30, he went back to the kitchen. She woke at 5. The clarity of her head was the first thing she noticed. Not good clarity, not fully recovered clarity. Just better than the night before. The ceiling of her room, the pale gray of early light, then the blanket. She had gone to sleep with one blanket, and she had two now. She sat up slowly and looked at the nightstand. The glass of water was full. She had not filled it last night. She specifically remembered not filling it because she had been too tired and told herself she would if she woke in the night. She looked at the chair in the corner. It was not against the wall where she kept it. It was 2 feet out from the wall, angled, positioned exactly the way you would position a chair if you were sitting in it and looking at the bed. She sat in her own bed and looked at the chair and felt something move through her that she did not entirely know how to contain. He had been here, in the dark, while she slept. Not in the way of someone checking in briefly and leaving. The chair placement told her he had stayed for a while, long enough to sit, long enough to stay. She thought about the legal document in the kitchen drawer, about the winter stores in the barn, about the cold medicine on the table, about the fence post she had replaced and the way he had looked at it, and the words that had come out of him with such careful difficulty. I've noticed all of it. She thought about a man who had decided that keeping his distance was protecting her. And she thought about herself, who had decided that keeping her distance was protecting herself. Both of them operating from the same basic fear, through the same mechanism of withdrawal, creating between them a marriage that functioned and breathed and moved and had no real warmth in it. The chair was 2 feet from the wall. She got up and went to the kitchen. He was at the counter, not at the table, not sleeping. At the counter, with a second cup of coffee, looking at the day's work list. He turned when she came in. She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her steadily. "How do you feel?" "Better." She went to the coffee maker. "Callum, we need to talk. Not now, you don't have to stop what you're doing. But at some point today." A brief pause. "All right." She poured her coffee. He went back to his list. The kitchen was warm, the fire already going in the wood stove, and outside the Montana morning was arriving in the slow, serious way of a November morning, deliberate and gray and real. She sat down at the table and wrapped her hands around her mug. 2 mugs on the table this morning, like every morning. One for her, one for him. She had never stopped to think about who put them there. Today, she noticed. Madison's truck pulled into the driveway on a Friday afternoon in the second week of November. Ellie was in the barn when she heard it. She came to the barn door and looked out and saw the truck, a dark green pickup she recognized from the photo in the hallway. And then she saw the young woman who got out of it, 22 years old. Callum's face, but with something lighter in it, something that had not spent 47 years learning to be careful. Long dark hair, a medical school backpack over one shoulder. Ellie watched Callum come out of the house, and the two of them embrace in the driveway, with the ease of people who were deeply familiar with each other. Madison said something and laughed, and Callum put his hand on top of her head, the way you did with someone whose head you had been patting since they were small. Ellie went back into the barn. She finished Roan's afternoon treatment without hurrying and without taking longer than necessary either. She was being honest with herself about needing a few minutes, which was its own small kind of progress. When she walked back to the house, she went in through the back door. Madison was at the kitchen table. Callum was making coffee. The room had the bright, disorganized energy of a homecoming, jackets dropped on chairs, Madison's backpack spilling medical school paperwork, someone's phone playing music softly on the counter. Madison looked up when Ellie came in. "Ellie," she said, not unfriendly, careful in the way of someone trying. "Madison, good drive?" "Not bad." The pass was clear. "Good timing?" Ellie said. "Another week and it might not be." "That's what I figured." Madison turned back to whatever she had been saying to her father. Ellie hung up her barn coat and washed her hands at the sink and began taking things out to start dinner. She worked around them, quiet and efficient, which she was good at. Too good at. She knew it even as she was doing it. The way she arranged herself around other people, taking up exactly as much space as was clearly allocated to her, and not 1 inch more. The old instinct, the one she had spent years carefully not thinking about, because thinking about it made it harder to execute. The first evening went well enough on the surface. Callum cooked the dinner, something he clearly did not do often, but which he had clearly planned, the kind of meal that requires afternoon preparation. Madison's favorite, evidently, a roast with root vegetables and biscuits, the specific meal of someone who has been feeding a particular person since childhood. Madison ate with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who has been eating dining hall food for months and has been waiting for this. They talked easily together. About school. About the cases Madison had been assigned to observe. About a professor she admired. About a classmate she found difficult. The conversation had the specific rhythm of two people who had been talking for decades, who knew each other's references and patterns, who could leave a sentence half-finished and be understood. Ellie was at the table. She participated when addressed. She asked Madison one question about her program and got a detailed and genuinely interesting answer. And then Callum said something, and the conversation turned. She ate her dinner. She noticed, with the slightly detached clarity of an outside observer, that she was doing the disappearing thing, making herself smaller than the room required. It was not anything Madison had done. It was her. 16 years of training, the kind that became reflexive. And then Callum said, mid-conversation, "Ellie, what happened with the McAllister dog? The one you were treating last week?" She looked up. He was looking at her, waiting for the answer with what appeared to be genuine interest. Madison glanced between them. Ellie told the story. It was actually a good story, involving a Great Dane and a particularly stubborn Splinter, and a technique she had improvised from something she'd read years ago, and she told it the way she told stories when she forgot to be nervous, which was directly and with the absurdist detail that made the thing actually funny. Madison laughed at the right places. After dinner, doing dishes with Callum at the stink, while Madison was in the other room on her phone, Ellie said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her sideways. "Pull me into the conversation," she said. "I wanted to know about the dog," he said, which might have been entirely true. She handed him a wet dish to dry and did not say anything else. The second morning, Callum went out to check the south pasture fence, which had been his plan and which took him away from the house until noon. Ellie and Madison were in the kitchen together. It was not uncomfortable, exactly. More accurately, it was the specific mild tension of two people who were trying and not quite sure how. Madison was at the table with her textbooks. Ellie was working on the veterinary supply order for the clinic. They were companionable in a functional way. Then Madison looked up from her book and said, "Do you plan on staying here long term?" She said it without any particular inflection, genuinely asking. Ellie's hands went still on her papers. She looked at her stepdaughter. At the 22-year-old with Callum's face and clear eyes that were not hostile, just direct. Do you plan on staying here long term? As though this were not her home, as though it were a temporary situation with an expiration date to be negotiated. Ellie sat with the question. She thought about the kitchen drawer with the legal document in it. She thought about her name on the county property records. She thought about the separate bedrooms and the thin wall and the chair that had been 2 feet from the wall. I don't think that's a short question, Ellie said finally. Madison's expression shifted slightly. Not defensive, thoughtful. I didn't mean, she started. I know, Ellie said. I'm not upset. And she genuinely wasn't. Something about the directness of the question was clarifying, actually, like cold water. I'm just saying, it's not a question I can answer in a sentence. Madison looked at her for a moment. My dad doesn't talk about it, she said. Whatever is happening between you two. I can't tell, she stopped. What you can't tell, Ellie prompted. If it's working, Madison said. I can't tell if it's working. The honesty of it landed simply between them. Neither can I, Ellie said, but I think we're trying to find out. Madison was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to her textbook. Ellie went back to her supply order. But something in the room felt slightly different. That afternoon, after Madison had gone for a drive, and Ellie was alone in the kitchen, she opened the drawer and took out the folder with her name on it again. She sat with it at the table and read it properly, this time. Every page. The legal language, which was dense but not indecipherable. The description of the property, which she knew from 2 years of walking it. The signatures, his and the notary's, and the date, 18 months ago. He had sat across from her at this table for 18 months since then. He had handed her coffee and talked about fence lines and worked beside her in silence, and never once said, I did this thing. I put your name here. I decided you belonged here before I knew how to say it. She thought about why someone did that. Not for legal reasons. Not for tax reasons. Not for any practical reason she could identify. You did that because you had made a decision about someone, and you needed to act on it, even if you could not yet speak it. It was the action of a man who communicated in actions rather than words, who showed rather than said, who had been showing her things for 2 years that she had not known how to read because she had not been looking for that kind of language. She put the folder back in the drawer, and she went to find him in the barn. She found him at the end of the barn, working on a piece of equipment. He looked up when she came in. She said, I found the folder. He went very still. The county document, she said, with my name on it. A pause. He set down the tool he had been holding. When? A week ago, but I needed some time with it before I could talk about it. He nodded once. The way he nodded when he was processing something rather than responding to it. She leaned against the stall railing, a few feet away from him. Roan was at the water bucket, unconcerned. Why didn't you tell me? She said, not accusing, genuinely asking. Callum was quiet for a moment, because showing you would mean you'd have to decide something. Make a choice. I didn't want to force a choice. She looked at him. That's not yours to decide. I know. The words came out simply, without defense. You removed my right to know something important that affected my own life, she said. You thought you were protecting me from pressure, but you were making a decision for me. He met her eyes. You're right, he said. Just that. No deflection. She had not expected that. The directness of it made something in her chest loosen slightly. I'm not angry, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm trying to understand. What do you want to understand? Why you did it in the first place, she said. The document. 6 months after we got married, you barely knew me. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, I knew enough. She waited. You fixed the storage room door in the 3rd month, he said. You didn't tell me. You just fixed it because it was broken, and you walked past it. The barn roof patch in the 4th month. The east fence panel. He paused. I knew enough. She looked at him. You take care of things, he said. You don't make a production of it. You don't require credit. You just see something that needs doing, and you do it. She was quiet. That's rare, he said. That's the kind of person. He stopped, tried again. I wanted you to have the ground under your feet, even if you decided you didn't want to stay. She thought about that for a moment. I found the document, she said carefully. And one of my first thoughts was that I didn't know what I would have decided if you'd shown it to me 6 months after the wedding. I don't know if I was ready to be shown something like that. That's why I didn't show you, he said. I didn't know what I was ready for. And you decided for me what I was ready for. Don't you see the problem? He was looking at her with something that wasn't quite discomfort and wasn't quite understanding and was somewhere honestly between them. I'm learning that, he said finally. She told him about Denver that night. They were in the kitchen after dinner. Madison had gone to bed early, back to Seattle the following morning. The fire was going. The wind was doing its November thing outside. She started talking because she was tired of the weight of carrying it in a house that didn't know what she was carrying. She talked about Robert Carter. She talked about 16 years. She did not talk dramatically, not the way this kind of thing sometimes went. She talked the way she did most things, precisely, without excess. She told him what 16 years of being slowly taught that her needs were a burden actually felt like. Not a single dramatic moment. Many small ones, the way a person could absorb a belief about themselves across years until it became background. Callum did not say anything while she talked. He listened in the way he listened, which was fully, without filling the silence with reassurance or commentary. When she finished, she picked up her coffee mug. It was cold. She put it back down. I'm not telling you this because I want you to fix it, she said. I just needed you to know it exists because it affects how I'm in this house and in this marriage. And I think you've noticed some of it and not understood what you were looking at. Yes, he said quietly. What have you noticed? He thought about it. That you apologize before there's anything to apologize for, he said. That you find something to do in another room when Madison calls. That you eat standing at the counter sometimes, like you're not sure you've earned a seat at the table. She absorbed that. It's not your job to fix any of that, she said. It's mine. I just wanted you to know what's there. I know it's not my job to fix it, he said, but it is my job to not make it worse. She looked at him. Have you been making it worse? The separate rooms, he said. The way he stopped. Started again. I am not good at this, he said, at saying what I mean when what I mean is something I'm not sure how to mean. I know, she said. The separate rooms, he said again, were partly what Earl said, about Sarah, about not being close enough to miss something again. He looked at his hands, then at her. But they were also partly because I could tell something had happened to you before you got here, and I didn't want to be one more person who didn't give you enough room. She sat with that. That's generous, she said finally, but it's also a decision you made about what I needed without asking me. Yes. Same problem. Yes. He looked at her steadily. What do you need? It was such a direct question. After 2 years of everything being communicated in objects and avoidance, and the language of practical arrangements, she felt the directness of it like something physical. I need to be in a marriage where someone is actually there, she said, not managing me from a safe distance, actually there. He was quiet for a moment. I can try to do that, he said, not promising ease, promising effort. She nodded. That's what I'm asking for. The third night was when they stepped back, not through any agreement, not through a fight. Something had shifted, and both of them felt it, and both of them, in the way of people who were more comfortable protecting than reaching, pulled back from the edge of it. She started going to the barn earlier and coming in later. He found work on the far side of the property. They were polite at meals, careful. The gap between them, which had been quietly narrowing, opened back up. She knew it was happening. She suspected he did too. But knowing something is happening and being able to stop it are different skills, and they were both out of practice with the second one. It was late November before she acknowledged to herself that they had backed away from something important, and neither of them had tried to get back to it. Everything continued. That was the strange part. The ranch ran. The meals happened. The firewood got stacked. She continued. Roan's follow-up checks, now twice a week, as he graduated from the intensive care phase. The horse was essentially healed, moving well, putting full weight on the leg, with only the slight preference for the other side that might or might not fade over time. She sat with the follow-up log open one afternoon and looked at the last entry. Day 91. Full weight bearing, left front, no heat, no swelling. Prognosis, complete recovery. The reason she had started coming to this barn at 5:30 every morning was gone. Not the horse. The horse was there, but the medical necessity, the thing that had given her clear purpose in this barn, in this space, on this ranch, that was resolved. She could stop coming. She thought about that, about whether stopping was what she actually wanted. And then she thought about something else. About whether, in 2 years of this marriage, she had ever made a choice about it, based purely on what she actually wanted, or whether she had been fitting herself to the shape of circumstances, always, the way she had learned to do. She closed the log and sat in the barn for a while. Roan came to the stall door and put his nose near her shoulder. She let him, put her hand up and rubbed the flat of his forehead the way he liked. I know, she said to him, which was not a specific thing, but felt true enough. She and Callum coexisted in a politeness that was more painful than argument. She had not understood, until this particular form of it, that politeness could be a kind of cruelty, not intentional cruelty. The cruelty of two people being very careful not to hurt each other by being very careful not to touch each other at all, in any direction. He refilled her coffee. She said thank you. He told her the forecast was calling for more snow on the weekend. She said she had seen that. He said the South Road might get difficult. She said she would plan around it. Functional, efficient, cold. She went to bed one night and lay in the dark and thought about the chair that had been 2 feet from the wall. About her name in a county property record. About a man who went to the barn at 11 o'clock at night because a horse was hurt. She thought about two people who had been handed an opportunity to say something true to each other and then, out of long habit, backed away. She thought about this for a long time. Then she made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not a declaration, a simple one. She was going to stop backing away. She came downstairs before him the next morning, put the kettle on, took out the eggs, started the stove, got 12 mugs from the cabinet, the ones with the blue rim that had been Sarah's, which she had used every morning for 2 years without thinking too hard about it, and would continue to use because they were good mugs. When she heard his footsteps on the stairs, she did not turn around from the stove. He came into the kitchen, and she heard him stop when he saw she was already there. The small pause of someone recalibrating. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. He went to the counter for his coffee. She said, to the eggs in the pan. I know Roan's healed. He went still behind her. She kept cooking. I'm still going to keep coming to the barn, not because he needs daily care. I want you to know why before I just keep showing up. She heard him set his mug down. I'm here because I chose to be, she said. Not because I had nowhere else to go. Not because it's convenient. Not because it's what I was doing and it's hard to stop doing something. Because I made a choice. She paused, turned the eggs. I wanted you to know that it's a choice. Because I've spent enough time in this marriage, hoping you could somehow tell the difference without me saying it. And you can't, and that's not your fault. It's mine for not saying it. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of eggs in the pan. She plated them, set one plate on his side of the table, sat down with her own. He did not sit right away. She picked up her fork and started eating. She was not going to perform the waiting. She had said the thing. The rest was his. After a moment, he sat down. They ate. He refilled her coffee. She said, "Thank you." And then he said, while they were still at the table, with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything he said that mattered. I met with the attorney 2 weeks ago. She looked up. The co-ownership document, he said. I had it filed with the county. Your name's on record now. Not just in a drawer. It can't be changed without your signature. A pause. Whatever happens, she looked at him across the table. Whatever happens. You should have told me about the document, she said. Yes, he said. You should have shown it to me 18 months ago. Yes, we're going to have to get better at telling each other things, she said. I know. I'm going to have to get better at asking. I know that too. She put her fork down. She looked at this man, this careful, deliberate, difficult man who had filled extra coffee cups and bought winter stores for 2 people and fixed fence posts in the dark and sat in a chair beside her door at 2 in the morning because she had said his name. Callum, she said. Yes, I want to try living in the same part of this house. A pause. 1 part, she said. Not 2. He looked at her for a long moment. She had no idea what was behind his eyes, and for once that did not frighten her. She was saying the thing. She was leaving it in the open between them and not reaching out to take it back. All right, he said, 2 words. But the way he said them, the same quiet steadiness he said everything with, she believed them completely. That afternoon, they worked together in the barn. No dramatic conversation. No culminating embrace. Just work, both of them. The regular work of maintaining a space that needed maintaining. She cleaned and reorganized the medical supply area. He checked the water heating system for the winter months ahead. They worked the way they had come to work when it was going well. Without needing to coordinate out loud, he moved to give her room. She moved to give him room. The barn had its sounds, and their work had its sounds, and underneath all of it was something she could not name, but could feel. The thing that had been missing. Not romance. Not yet, not that simply. But presence. The sense that both of them were actually there, actually in the same space, not managing each other from a careful distance, but genuinely in the room. Rowan stood stall and watched them both, the way he watched when the atmosphere suited him. She was at the supply cabinet, reorganizing the antibiotics by expiration date, when she heard Callum cross the barn toward her. She turned. He was close. Closer than he had stood in 2 years of careful distance. He was looking at her with the direct look he gave to things he was trying to understand properly, the same look he gave to fence lines and water systems and work that needed to be done right. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to be better at it," he said. "I can't promise to be natural at it, but I will be better at it." She looked up at him. "I know that, too." He reached out slowly, the way he did everything, and put his hand against her face. Just that. His hand, her cheek. Warm. Present. She put her hand over his. They stood like that in the barn for a moment. Two people, not quite used to this. Learning the first edges of it. Outside, the Montana afternoon was going silver and cold. Roan moved once in his stall and was still. The first thing that changed was not gradually, not through discussion. It simply changed one morning and continued to change, the way real things change, by being done repeatedly until they are the shape of a life. She started coming downstairs at the same time. He started making enough for both of them without thinking about it separately. They ate together with the morning in front of them, the day's work, the specific quiet of two people who had made a decision not to be quiet in the way that cost something. They talked. Not about everything. Not all at once. This was not a story about people who suddenly became fluent in each other after a long silence. They were still learning. They made mistakes. He held things back sometimes, and then had to go back and say them. She apologized reflexively sometimes, and had to correct herself. They were working at it. But they were working. Madison came for Christmas. 3 days before she arrived, Callum said to Ellie at dinner, "I want to talk to her about you." She looked up. "About who you are here," he said. "She doesn't know." "That's my fault. I should have made it clear sooner." She thought about that conversation in the kitchen. Madison asking, "Do you plan on staying long-term?" With no apparent awareness that the answer was yes and had been for some time. "What are you going to say?" Ellie asked. "That you are my wife," he said. "Not a tenant, not a guest, not a practical arrangement. My wife, and that this is your home." He paused. "If that's still true." "It's still true," she said. He nodded, that deliberate nod. "Then that's what I'm going to tell her." When Madison arrived this time, the house felt different. Not to Madison, probably. Not immediately. But Ellie moved through it differently. She did not find things to do in other rooms. She stayed at the table during dinner and talked, and when she ran out of things to say, she let the silence be comfortable, instead of trying to fill it or remove herself from it. Callum, for his part, did a thing she had not seen him do before. He said, at dinner on the first night, "Madison, I should have said this sooner. I want you to understand that Ellie is not temporary. This is her home. She belongs here. That should have been clear from the beginning, and it wasn't. And that's on me." Madison looked at her father, then at Ellie. Ellie did not say anything. She did not need to. Madison looked down at her plate. "I didn't make it easy," she said quietly. "No," Callum said. "But you didn't have all the information." A pause. Then Madison said, to Ellie, with the directness she had inherited from her father, "I wasn't trying to make you feel like a guest." "I know," Ellie said. And she did. "I just didn't know what to do with you," Madison said. "My dad doesn't explain things." I've noticed, Ellie said. Madison looked at her father. Something moved across her face, complicated and young and genuine. Are you okay? She asked him, which was, Ellie understood, the real question, the one underneath the others. Yes, Callum said. He looked at Ellie when he said it briefly, and then back at his daughter. Getting there. Madison nodded slowly. Then she picked up her fork. Tell me about the horse, she said to Ellie. So Ellie did. One night in January, Ellie woke at 3 in the morning. Not from a bad dream, not from illness. She simply woke, which happened sometimes, and lay looking at the ceiling of the room she was in. The room she was in was not the room she had been in for 2 years. She had moved her things down the hall at the end of November. Quietly, without ceremony, over the course of an afternoon. He had helped her move the bookshelf because it was heavy. They had not made speeches about it. It had simply happened the way real changes happened, through action rather than announcement. She lay now in the dark and listened to the house. The fire had died down, but the heat was still in the walls. Outside, January had the Montana cold. That was past argument. That simply was what it was, the kind of cold that had been arriving here every year for centuries and intended to continue. The wind was low. The house was quiet. She could hear Callum breathing beside her. Slow, even, the rhythm of someone deeply asleep. She lay next to him and listened to it for a while, this ordinary sound, evidence of another person in the same space, and felt something in her chest that had no complicated name. She had been alone in a room for a long time, not in the literal sense, not always, but in the way that counted. She had been a person moving through spaces without quite arriving in them, fitting herself to the available shape, leaving as little evidence of herself as possible. She was finished with that. She turned on her side and closed her eyes and listened to him breathe until she fell back asleep. One morning in February, Pete Hendricks said to a customer in his store, "You know, Irongate looks different since fall." The customer asked what he meant. Pete thought about it. He was a man who liked to get things right, like somebody decided to stay, he said. You can tell when a place has somebody in it who decided to stay. Old Earl, who had been in the store for crackers and who had been listening from the next aisle, made a sound that was not quite a word. Pete looked over at him. Woman knew how to fix a fence post, Earl said. Man knew enough to notice. He put the crackers on the counter. Rest of it follows. He paid and went out into the cold February morning, and the bell above the door rang once and was still. Late afternoon, Irongate Ranch. The February light that came through the barn door was the particular low gold of winter ending, the light that arrived at an angle and made long shadows eastward. The light that told you spring was still a ways off, but not impossibly far. Ellie was in the barn. She was preparing the second stall. It had been empty since before she came, empty for years, probably since before Sarah. She was laying down fresh bedding, checking the water heater connection, making sure the dimensions were right for what they had been discussing. They had looked at a mare in early January, a 5-year-old bay from a ranch south of Crestfall. Steady temperament, healthy papers. They were going back to look at her again next week. She worked steadily without hurrying. Roan was in his stall, watching her with the interested expression he got when something new was happening in his vicinity. He was fully healed now. The left leg bore weight indistinguishably from the right. You would not know, looking at him, that there had ever been anything wrong. She heard Callum come in through the barn's main door, did not turn around. She heard him cross to Roan's stall, heard his hand on the door latch, heard the horse shift in greeting. She kept working. He came around to the second stall and leaned on the rail beside her, watching what she was doing. After a moment, he stepped in and picked up the other end of what she was doing without being asked. They worked together in the small space, not talking much, not needing to. The barn had its sounds and their work had its sounds, and beneath all of it was something that had taken 2 years of quiet and one night of his name called through the dark. And a chair moved 2 feet from a wall, and a legal document filed with the county, and 3 months of a horse being patiently healed, something that was not perfect and was not finished and was genuinely, stubbornly, unambiguously real. She had come here uncertain. She was uncertain still about many things. The future was large and unresolved the way the future always was. Madison was still learning her. The ranch had years of work ahead of it. She and Callum were still, in many ways, two careful people learning to be less careful with each other. But her hands were steady. She noticed that without looking for it. She was wrapping the water line in insulation for the freeze protection, and her hands were doing exactly what she asked of them. Without hesitation, without that small unsteadiness that had been there in the first days of October, when she had come to the barn, each morning, knowing the horse was almost healed, and she was running out of reasons, she understood. She had a reason now. She had chosen it. Callum stood up from where he had been checking the floor drainage. He looked at what they had done together in the past half hour. The stall was ready, clean, properly set up, the right amount of bedding, the water line secure. "Next week," he said. "Next week," she agreed. He was looking at her, not at the stall. The way he looked at things he had made a decision about. Steady, thorough. She looked back at him. The late afternoon light was in the barn, now at the low angle, catching the dust in the air, making the ordinary interior of an old working barn look briefly like something worth photographing. Roan moved in his stall. Somewhere outside, the wind moved across the Arongate land. She had been a woman who made herself invisible. She was finished with that. She picked up her bag and slung it over her shoulder. He held the stall gate for her. They walked out of the barn together into the cold February afternoon, into the long gold light of a Montana winter ending, onto the ground that had her name on it. The second stall was ready. Spring was coming. She was staying. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
There is a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. Not the dramatic ones. Not the night she called his name. Not the legal document in the drawer. Not the conversation that finally broke open 2 years of careful silence. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than all of those. It is a chair, moved 2 feet from the wall, in the dark, while she was sleeping. That is the whole story, really. Everything else is just the road that leads to that chair. We live in a world that tells us love should be loud, that it should announce itself, that real feelings come with speeches and grand gestures and moments dramatic enough to remember clearly. And so we learn to wait for those moments. We wait for the right time, the right words, the right signal that it is safe to stop being careful. And while we are waiting, life goes on in the kitchen, in the barn, in the hallway between 2 closed doors, and the people we love are right there, close enough to hear through a thin wall, and we still manage to miss each other completely. Ellie and Callum were not bad people. That matters. They were not selfish or cruel or broken beyond repair. They were 2 decent people who had each been hurt in ways that made closeness feel dangerous, and so they each built the same wall from opposite sides and then wondered why the house felt empty. She had learned that her needs were a burden. He had learned that loving someone was just another way to lose them. And those two lessons, taken together, built a marriage that functioned perfectly and felt like nothing. The moral of this story is not that love conquers all. That is too easy and not entirely true. The moral is that love requires a decision. Not once, but repeatedly, in small ways, in the ordinary moments of an ordinary day. The decision to say the thing instead of hoping it will somehow be understood. The decision to receive care without immediately calculating what you owe in return. The decision to move the chair 2 feet from the wall and sit down and stay. Both of them had to choose. Both of them had to stop protecting each other from the wrong things. That is what healing in a marriage actually looks like. Not a single moment of breakthrough. A long series of small choices made in the direction of each other until one day you realize the wall is gone and neither of you can quite remember which brick came down first. You do not have to be perfect. You just have to keep choosing. That is enough. That has always been enough.